I have lived through 12 recessions. 12, and if you asked most people what a recession means, they would give you the same answer every time. Job losses, fear, shrinking accounts, bad headlines, tight credit, canceled plans. That is how recessions look from the outside. That is how they feel to people who enter them unprepared. But that is not the only thing a recession is. A recession is also a transfer of assets from weak hands to strong ones, a transfer of confidence from the public narrative to the private buyer, a transfer of opportunity away from the man who must react toward the man who prepared before reaction was necessary. That is why I have never thought about recessions the way television thinks about recessions. Television wants emotion urgency. Fear, a man with a loud voice and a red chart telling you that the world is now becoming dangerous. That is not useful to me. I prefer structure, I prefer mechanism, I prefer understanding the rules of the game before everybody else around me realizes there was a game at all. That is what I learned early in life, and it has served me through every downturn I have ever seen. A recession is not simply something that happens to you. It is something that can happen for you if you are ready. That sentence sounds hard to some people, almost unfair, because recessions really do hurt. They hurt workers, they hurt families, they hurt businesses that were never strong enough to absorb much pressure. They expose foolishness, they punish leverage, they punish delay. They punish optimism built on debt and identity built on consumption. They can be cruel. I am not romanticizing any of that. I am telling you the truth that sits beside it. The same event that destroys one person's balance sheet often opens another person's life. That is the whole pattern. And once you see it clearly, you stop consuming recessions as scary stories and start reading them as environments. Environments with rules. Environments that reward some behaviors and punish others. Most people never learn those rules because the economy is designed to keep them busy, not to keep them reflective. They work, they spend, they upgrade. They tell themselves they are doing well because the visible markers of life keep improving. Better apartment, better car, better restaurants, better vacations, better clothes, a slightly more expensive version of the same loop from the outside. That looks like progress. From the inside, if you look carefully enough, it is often just a treadmill with softer lighting. That is the first thing I want you to understand. A treadmill is not wealth. A treadmill is movement without distance. A treadmill keeps you occupied. It keeps you sweating. It gives the sensation of effort. But if the machine stops, you have gone nowhere. That is how many people live financially. They are busy enough to feel responsible and tired enough to feel virtuous, but the structure underneath their lives has very little true resilience in it. This becomes visible only when the economy changes. That is why recessions are so clarifying. They do not create fragility from nothing. They reveal it. Now, let me tell you about two people. Same age, same broad income, same country, same basic opportunity set. At least that is how it looked from the outside. The first person did what almost everyone does. Every time income rose, life expanded, a better lease, a better car payment, better furniture, more dinners out, more subscriptions, more conveniences. The improvement in income translated instantly into improvement in lifestyle. And because that pattern is socially rewarded, nobody around him thought anything was wrong. In fact, they thought he was succeeding. He thought so too. That is part of what makes this so dangerous. The trap feels like progress while you are inside it. The second person did something quieter. Every time income rose, life barely moved. Not because she was miserable, not because she hated spending, because she understood that margin matters more than appearance. She kept the apartment a little longer. She drove the car a little longer. She said no to some upgrades no one would remember 6 months later. She let the gap between income and lifestyle remain open. Then she moved that gap somewhere quiet. Cash savings, broad investments, not dramatic things, not things that won applause, things that built room. For a while, nothing about these two lives seemed different enough to matter. That is another crucial truth. The early stages of wealth and the early stages of financial fragility often look almost identical from the outside. Then the economy softened, hours got cut, hiring froze, Companies became cautious, credit stopped feeling generous, and the difference between the two lives became enormous almost overnight. The first person panicked because his expenses had grown right up to the edge of his old income. He had very little stored, and the life he built was expensive enough that even a modest change in conditions began to feel like personal disaster. He sold things, he missed payments, he became reactive. The second person was not celebrating, but she was calm. And calm is worth more in a downturn than most people understand, because calm lets you see. She looked at good businesses trading at ugly prices. She looked at property owners under pressure. She looked at people who needed liquidity more than they needed dignity. She was in a position to act while the first person was still trying to survive. Same income, different architecture, different outcome. That is what I call the liquidity divide. Some people describe it as a liquidity trap when the household has built a life so inflexible that once income changes, every decision becomes triage. That is exactly right. Liquidity is not just cash in a technical sense. Liquidity is breathing room. Liquidity is time. Liquidity is the ability to avoid doing something stupid simply because you are cornered. If your income stopped tomorrow, how long could you last without becoming someone else's emergency? That is not a dramatic question. It is one of the most useful financial questions on earth, and the answer tells you far more about your actual strength than your salary does. I have kept large amounts of cash ready for most of my adult life. People sometimes interpret that as hesitation. They imagine cash is just money that failed to find something better to do. That is not how I think about it. Cash is optionality. Cash is stored calm. Cash is a way of saying to the world, when others are forced to sell, I would like the right to think rather than the obligation to react. This is what most people misunderstand. Liquidity is not only a financial position, it is a psychological position. The man with a true cushion thinks differently from the man who is one missed paycheck away from improvisation. The second man may be intelligent, ethical, and hardworking. It does not matter. Pressure changes the quality of thought. Desperation is one of the most expensive states of mind in all of finance. That is why the first principle before a recession is so simple and so unglamorous. Build real liquidity before you need it. Not imaginary liquidity, not a credit card, not a line you can draw on if the bank still likes you, not a vague belief that something will work out. Enough that if income stops, your life does not immediately become a negotiation with panic. Now let us turn to debt. I want you to think about debt differently. Debt is not just a balance on a screen. It is not a monthly payment. It is not a number you get used to because it has been there a long time. Debt is borrowed time from your future. Every dollar owed is work not yet done. That is what makes debt so dangerous. It creates a claim on the future self before the future self has even had the chance to breathe. Then interest enters, and the whole thing becomes more violent. I have spent enough time studying compounding to know that most people love it when it is working for them and ignore it when it is working against them. Compound interest is one of the great wealth builders. It is also one of the great destroyers when attached to the wrong side of your balance sheet. A credit card charging more than 20% is not a convenience. It is a machine. It compounds quietly. It collects without emotion. It does not care whether your month was hard, whether inflation has been unfair, or whether you intended only to borrow briefly. It keeps charging. That is why I say debt is not mainly a spending issue. It is a future issue. Every dollar used to service high-interest debt is a dollar that cannot compound for you, cannot be turned into liquidity, cannot be used during a downturn to buy value from the desperate. It is not merely spent, it is captured. This matters even more going into a recession because income often shrinks exactly when debt becomes least forgiving. Hours get cut. Sales slow. Bonuses disappear. Business softens. The debt does not care. It remains on schedule, same rate, same due date, same compounding against you. That is how a slowdown becomes a spiral. Not because the person was foolish in one spectacular moment, because the structure was already weak and recession removes the margin that had been hiding the weakness. So if you want to enter a recession with strength, The instruction is brutally clear. Reduce high interest debt before the storm arrives. Do not decorate your life while carrying a compounding leak in the hull. Do not fantasize about future investments while the present is paying 20% to a lender. A household carrying expensive consumer debt into recession is not positioned, it is exposed. Now we come to something even quieter than debt. Identity. This one never appears in neat financial textbooks because it sounds too psychological, too soft, too hard to quantify. That is precisely why it matters so much. Many people do not merely spend money. They use spending to maintain a version of themselves. A car says something, an apartment says something, a phone says something, a vacation says something, a restaurant says something, a wardrobe says something. None of these things are simply purchases once the ego gets involved. They become signals. They become emotional architecture. They become part of how a person answers, often unconsciously, the question of who he is. That is why cutting back feels so painful to many people, even when they know mathematically it would help them. It is not just a budget decision, it feels like a threat to identity. If a person defines success by visible lifestyle, then reducing visible lifestyle feels like becoming less. That is a terrible place from which to build wealth, because wealth often requires exactly the opposite move. It requires tolerating periods where the outside looks smaller than the inside. The richest people I have known were not always the most visibly luxurious. Very often they were the least theatrically attached to consumption. They identified with their principles, their process, their long view, their patience, their standards. Possessions were tools, not mirrors. That gave them a kind of emotional immunity. When conditions changed, they did not feel the same violent need to preserve appearances because appearances were never the deepest source of self to begin with. I understand why this is difficult. Modern culture works very hard to connect self-worth to spending. Advertising does not really sell objects. It sells belonging. It sells personality. It sells what kind of human being you are allowed to feel like after purchase. That is why so many people keep upgrading even when the arithmetic is against them. They are not buying the product alone. They are buying permission to feel like a certain kind of person. That is one of the most expensive habits a future wealthy person can carry. If you stripped away the car, the furniture, the apartment, the branded signals, and the lifestyle markers, would you still know who you are? That is not just a philosophical question, it is a financial one. Because the less your identity depends on consumption, the less fragile you become when conditions demand restraint. Now let us move to something I think people underestimate even more than identity. Environment. The financial world worships willpower far too much. Save more, spend less, be disciplined, stay focused. All fine slogans. But slogans are weak against exhaustion, social pressure, fear, distraction, and habit. I have never thought willpower alone was a very reliable long-term system. What I trust is design. Design your environment so the right behavior becomes easier than the wrong one. That is a much stronger strategy. If every paycheck lands in your checking account and sits there waiting to be interpreted by whatever mood you happen to be in that week, you will spend more than you intended. Not because you are broken, because that is what unstructured money does to tired human beings. If instead, a portion of the money leaves automatically the day it arrives and moves into savings or investments before your lifestyle has the chance to claim it, then something powerful happens. You begin living on what remains, your spending adapts, the future receives its share first, that is environment architecture. And it matters as much socially as it does financially. Who are the people around you? What do they normalize? What do they admire? If the people closest to you treat every raise as permission for a bigger lifestyle, if they laugh at caution, if they mistake restraint for fear and treat debt as normal background noise, then it will be harder to build something serious, no matter how smart you are. People mirror their environment more than they admit. Standards travel socially. So does carelessness. One of the reasons I was fortunate is that I spent time around people whose long-term thinking was stronger than mine until I learned to think that way myself. The voices around you matter. Build a system that supports discipline, and spend time with people whose financial lives make you calmer, not more performative. Then there is the final invisible enemy before a recession. Noise. We live in an economy where attention itself has been monetized. Every platform wants more of yours. Every news channel wants a stronger emotional reaction than the last one. Fear holds attention better than calm. Urgency holds attention better than reflection. So what gets amplified? Not balance, not perspective. Alarm. This matters immensely in downturns because fear does not only make people anxious. It steals clarity. It bends time. It makes short-term noise feel more real than long-term value. It tempts good people into making permanent decisions based on temporary emotion. I have watched this happen in every recession. The headlines become louder, the predictions become more dramatic, the public becomes more reactive. And the people who consume the most fear often make the most expensive decisions. They sell because everyone else is selling. They freeze because uncertainty feels intolerable. They convince themselves that panic is prudence. Then years later, they explain their losses as bad luck instead of what they really were. Noise turned into action. The market is a voting machine in the short term. It reflects mood in a recession. The vote is fear. But value does not disappear because mood changes. Good businesses are still good businesses. Productive assets are still productive assets. Panic does not erase worth. It distorts price. That is where calm becomes an asset. Not emotional numbness. Not denial. Calm. The ability to ask what is actually true here. The ability to turn the volume down and think from first principles. The ability to hold still while everybody else is running in circles. This is why clear thinking in recessions is worth more than any hot tip. The person who can stay quiet when the world gets loud will usually see things the frightened never get time to notice. So what do you do with all of this? You turn principles into action. I think the practical framework is very simple, though not easy. First, awareness. You must know exactly where you stand. Every expense, every debt, every interest rate, every automatic charge, every monthly obligation. Then ask the question I asked earlier without blinking. If income stopped tomorrow, how long could you last? If the answer is not enough to let you think clearly, then not optimization, not sophistication, cushion. Second, control. Build systems that work when you are tired, busy, and emotionally noisy. Automate saving, simplify accounts, attack the highest interest debt first. Reduce identity spending. Remove easy access to habits that keep you weak. Control means making the good behavior easier than the bad one. Third, growth. This is the part most people want first and deserve last. Growth during a recession belongs to those who prepared. When assets go on sale, when prices reflect fear more than value, when overextended owners must sell, that is where liquidity becomes a weapon. But only if you built it before you needed it. A recession is the best buying environment in years for the person who is not also a forced seller. Fourth, freedom. Money is not the goal. A number is not the goal. Freedom is the goal. Freedom from panic. Freedom from desperate work. Freedom to say no. Freedom to buy when others must sell. Freedom to live without one emergency resetting the entire emotional climate of the household. If your financial system is not buying you more freedom over time, then the system is not yet doing its job. This is why I think recessions are misunderstood. The public thinks they create the wealth gap. No, they reveal it. The gap was built before the downturn arrived. It was built in the months and years when some people increased lifestyle while others increased liquidity, when some people ignored debt while others cut it, when some people used spending to prop up identity while others used restraint to build room, when some people consumed fear and others built frameworks. That is when the future diverged. The recession merely makes the divergence visible, and that is what gives me confidence rather than fear. Not because I believe downturns are pleasant, because I know how repetitive the pattern is. The people who come out ahead are rarely the ones with the highest income or the loudest opinions. They are the ones who entered the downturn clean enough, calm enough, and liquid enough to think while others could only react. You can be that person not through inspiration, through preparation, through boring choices, through honesty, through design. So start now, build the cushion, kill the expensive debt, separate identity from spending, architect the environment, protect your attention, then wait not in anxiety but in readiness. Because when the recession comes, and I believe one is coming, it will not ask whether you deserve protection. It will ask whether you built it. That is the whole game. And once you understand that, a recession stops looking like pure danger and starts looking like what it has always been. A sorting event, a transfer event, a moment when the invisible architecture of people's lives becomes impossible to hide. Make sure yours is built before the weather turns. One last truth. Readiness is rarely dramatic in the moment. It looks small. A transfer that happens on payday. A card balance reduced instead of rolled forward. A quieter apartment than you could technically afford. A weekend where you stay home and strengthen the balance sheet instead of renting a feeling of success. None of those things look impressive. Then the cycle turns, and suddenly all those unimpressive acts begin converting into something the panicked cannot buy at the last minute. Judgment. Time options. That is what you are really building long before the recession headline tells you it has become urgent.